of Changing India by Iqbalunnisa Begum. For this session, we have Professor Tahera Aftab, who is adjunct professor in women's studies at the University of Karachi, and she also holds a PhD from the University of Karachi. And we have Dr. Salima Ahmed, who is well known for her services as a civil servant for 35 years with the government of Pakistan. She's the founder and life president of Pakistan Federation of Business and Professional Women's Organization. And she has represented Pakistan both as a government servant and as an NGO delegate at various conferences regarding the status of women. Above all, she is also the daughter of the author of this book, Changing India, A Woman Speaks. And we have Mr. Arif Zaman, who is the Executive Director, Commonwealth Business Women's Network, and also CEO, Risk-Air, and visiting faculty at Henley Business School, and the author of the best-selling book on reputational risk. He will be the moderator for this session, so over to them. But before that, may I please ask you to either switch off or put your mobiles on silent, because it interferes with the mic that comes up with a very disturbing, crackly sound. Thank you.
Right, okay. Right, hit the road, Jack, as they say. So good afternoon, welcome, salam alaikum, and I'm very honored and delighted that you're here. In fact, we have stiff competition in the interest of a free market economy. We have other competing sessions going on, but I'm very pleased to see this is a very respectable turnout. So it was 75 years ago. This is a journey that's taken 75 years, because it was 75 years ago that this book last appeared, until today. Because after 75 years, thanks to Oxford University Press, we have brought this book back into print, but we've done more than that. We've also added to it in various ways in terms of some of the author's other work and material. So I'm going to be very brief in my opening remarks, because you don't really want to hear too much from me, but I think from our two esteemed panelists, Dr. Salima Ahmed and Professor Tahera Aftab. So all I'm going to do is say some very brief remarks from the introduction. And this book is available. The commercial is very short. It's outside there. You can get it at a very reasonable price. But there is a very good introduction written in it by Asya Alam. And I'm just going to take no more than just 3 or 4 minutes to read a short extract from that. And then we'll go from there. So she writes, in 1940, Bangalore-based Society Press published a collection of essays and speeches called Changing India, a Muslim woman speaks by a woman named Iqbalunnisa Hussain. 4 years later, in 1944, the author followed this publication with a novel, Purdah and Polygamy, Life in an Indian Muslim Household. Significantly, one of the very first novels by a Muslim woman anywhere in the English language, published in 1944. Both texts highlight important concerns that were covered by Indian English writing, and also addressed by women's organizations such as the Women's Indian Association and the All India Women's Congress. Yet, neither texts figure in significant edited compendiums of Indian literature. So who is virtually forgotten here, and why? The task of recovery, analysis, and critique of women's writings has been foundational to feminist literary history. Feminist literary studies have questioned the processes involved in the formation of knowledge, including the production of disciplines, the norms of canon formation, and the institutionalization of intellectual critique. Furthermore, scholarship on non-Western societies has contested the very notion of feminism, critiquing the naturalizing tendencies of Western feminism and the marginalization of third world women. The publication, this publication of a new edition of Changing India and a renewed focus on the writings of Iqbalunnisa Hussain constitutes feminist efforts to resist marginalization within academic scholarship and reinterpret past voices for current readership. And the book represents little known but important engagement with questions of feminist and wider concern in South Asia during the decades of the 1930s and 1940s, involving Islam and relations between the East and the West, childhood and early education, gender inequality, domesticity, and sexual politics in the family. In her reformist efforts, Iqbalunnisa started a middle school for girls, an institute of vocational training for women, and formed a teachers' association in Bangalore. In 1933, remember, this was the year that Hitler came to power in Germany. This was 2 years before the All India Conference in 1935, so that's the period we're talking about. In 1933, she embarked on a ship from Colombo to begin her university education at the University of Leeds, where she arrived with her eldest son, who was my father. The thought of attending an educational institution in England started to preoccupy her from 1930, when she got her degree from the University of Mysore, and her desire came to fruition when in 1933 her son decided to depart for England for higher education. I don't want to spend more time, but just to touch on very briefly two areas. Many of the articles in the book talk about women's education, emancipation, and reform. There's also a very strong strand in the book, which is around internationalism. And she participated in particular in a number of meetings, but in particular the International Women's Congress that took place in Istanbul exactly 80 years ago, almost to the day. And she gave a speech in that conference. There were delegates there from Brazil, from Ceylon, from Syria, from Palestine, from Jamaica, and she gave a speech on East-West cooperation. And I just want to quote one sentence from that speech before we have the contributions from the panelists. And you remember, this was the colonial period. So what she said was, what we ought to realize is that Western civilization is modern, built on the experiences of many centuries in the East and in the West. To turn away from it, as it were something alien or hostile to us, is to misread the lessons of history. So with that, I've got one or two more things to say, but I don't want to take up more time. Also, I've been under very stern instructions from at least one of our panelists not to do that. So let me begin by asking Dr. Salima Ahmed, who is the daughter of Iqbalunnisa Hussain, the remaining sibling, what, in terms of her influences, I mean, clearly she was very active in a number of areas, but what would you say were her, in terms of her influences and her background, what are the key things that you would want to bring out that were her influences in her background?
Assalamu alaikum. First and foremost, I must thank Allah Ta'ala that He has given us, her children, to be able to go back and bring her to life again. My mother used to be writing all the time, and we didn't know what she was writing. We said, "Bichari mummy kuch likhte rehti hai." And I'm sorry to say we hadn't even read her books because we were quite young at the time, and the subject she wrote on was very high flown. And it's after more than 60 years that Arif has brought her to life again And I'm very grateful to him that he revived her. I don't know where he got the book from, because none of us children have the books. And he got it from the library in London. And from there he copied it and he persuaded the Oxford Press to reprint it, and had given us a chance to read the book again. And I was most amazed, because here was this lady who had never been to a school, and she had learned English from her husband, who was in Bombay and she was in Bangalore, and by correspondence. And she did her BA and got a gold medal, but we didn't really appreciate what it meant. And when I read her book, I was amazed. I said, this English is far better than mine. And I took a little excerpt from her book, and I was in a talk show on the television, and I got a standing ovation for her, a little expert, and all the long reading that I did, nobody took much notice. So the siblings, the children, have a superior aspect about their children, I'm afraid. And I forgot the question you gave me.
Well, it was a very rich life that she lived. She did a lot of things. She obviously came, as you've mentioned, she learned English by correspondence course when her husband was in Bombay. For the last 80 years, the books that she's written, in particular her novel, and Changing India, there are copies in the Library of Congress, there are copies in the British Library, and this is a woman that learned English by correspondence course. Now, many of us who haven't learned English by correspondence course haven't got copies in the British Library. So the question is, how does someone from that background, and I think you were telling me earlier, I have to refer to her as not Dr. Ahmed, but Pupijan, which I know you'll understand, so I have to. We're in Asia. There was opposition when she went. You were telling me that the community wasn't happy. Was that right?
When she went?
When she went into the UK.
Well, that was a revolution among the Muslim society, and delegations of Orthodox Muslims would come to my father and threaten him, and that he was sending his wife out to England by herself, except one little boy, her eldest son, and he said that she would become a Christian. I don't know what all terrible things she would become. And so my father had to not only look after 6 children, 3, 4 of them who were very young, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but he had to face these people. So from Bangalore, he went into Bangalore cantonment. We shifted. Cantonment, you remember, was a British cantonment, and it was a very different place to stay in. And it was in the cantonment that we were safer and we grew up. The greatest influence in my mother's life was, of course, my father. His courage to stand up to the opposition and the kind of background he came from. His family, his great-grandfather was in the Tipu Sultan's army. He had died along with him. And to his family, Tipu Sultan was an obsession. They would not go to an English school. They would not go to a hospital. When his village was struck by a plague, his whole family, half his family was wiped out. His village was half wiped out, but they would not go to a British hospital because it was British. And he came from that, and he got plague, and with 104.5 temperature, he walked 11 miles and came to Bangalore to a hospital, and since then, his mind revolted against orthodoxy and revolted against the part that his members of his family were playing, and he acquired better education for himself. And when he married, she was only spattering of Urdu and Arabic. And he educated her. And when he saw that she would like to go to England for further studies, he looked after 6 children. And he had to sell his beautiful house he had built brick by brick to finance her and his son to go to England. And I can't think of any other such an example in the Muslims who would sacrifice themselves for the education of his wife. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very, very powerful example. In fact, I think when she was in Europe, clearly it was a very, very exciting period, the 1930s. I mentioned the International Women's Congress. 1935, delegates from, all these different places. And I believe she gave, in the introduction, it's talked about, there's been just so the audience know, there's been a box file sitting in a desk or in a proverbial Smith College, Massachusetts, for the last 80 years. It's had a box file. This box file has been containing papers from that conference. Asya Alam, who is got a PhD from St. Austin, Texas, one of the sponsors of this conference, she unearthed that file. And in that file, she found the original speech that your mother gave. And that speech was on, she spoke on a number of topics, but there was one session with a room, and the records attest to this, the room was packed. There was standing room only practically, and it was on the whole area of East-West relations. And her take on that was this internationalism. But one of the things that I know you told me about was that 1935, Ataturk was still very much alive. He died in 36. We heard this morning, very pleased that Qureshi Saab, who joined us, the winner of the Best Non-Fiction Prize, who wrote about Ataturk in South Asia. Ataturk in 35. Tell us about what happened when Ataturk and at the conference.
My mother went to the conference in Istanbul from England, and Kemal Ataturk heard that a Muslim lady with 7 children from India had come to attend the conference, and he was very amazed and he wanted to meet her. And an interview was arranged, and he spoke to her for more than an hour. And he kept on asking her about the status of women Muslim women in India, and how proud he was of the work she has been doing. And it was a great thing for her to meet Kemal Ataturk.
One has to remember, this was a period when, the year that women got the vote in France, for example, 1944. So 9 years before that, this is what was happening. So can I just turn, we'll come back, Pubijan, for more questions in a second. I do want to give some time for the audience as well. But we're also very pleased to have Professor Tahera Aftab with us. And what I'd like to do, Professor Tahera Aftab, who's attached part of the faculty at the University of Karachi, the Center of Excellence for Women's Studies there. One of the points made in the introduction is the omission, the fact that this was someone who was called in her day by one of the vice chancellors of, I think, Delhi University, referred to her as the Jane Austen of India. She was referred to like that, and yet today, if you walk outside of this room, hardly anybody's heard of her. Why is that?
You have raised such a huge question. It will take maybe days and years for me to answer that. But this is it's a foundational question. What has happened in our history, in Pakistan particularly over the last several decades, is that instead of believing in what we read in the Quran, Iqra bismi rabbikal lazi, we have changed the meanings in our practical life. We say fight in the name of Allah instead of read in the name of Allah. So most of our energies are wasted in doing so. And in addition to that, we have developed a culture which is anti-women, which is anti-research, which is anti-studies. And therefore, women like Mrs. Iqbalunnisa Hussain, who wrote such a wonderful book, is lost. We don't read any longer. But then I tell you that I had at least 3 major encounters with the book. It's not lost completely. When I was in my junior year in college in Lucknow, by chance I read that book. I'm talking about the year 1959, when I graduated from IT college. I read that book there. And it was a very well read that book, because there were the signatures of other students who have already read that book. So that means it was known to, and there were readers. Next, when I read the book was when I was collecting some material for my book, Inscribing South Asian Muslim Women. And I wrote that book because I wanted to explore why women are neglected in history, why women's history is not known to us, where is the material? Because I wanted to introduce a teaching course on women's history, and everyone in my department made fun of me. Where would you get the material from? So I compiled that, which includes archival sources, unpublished material, and I have 4 different extracts from the 2 books of Iqbalunnisa Hussain, that is Changing India, and the other one is the novel. It's about polygamy. So people who really want to read it, they do. And I did some research also when I was on a Fulbright scholarship in America, and I was trying to look at what sort of contacts Muslim women of this pre-partition India had with Christian missionaries. And I thought John Spears, who wrote the first preface, was a Christian missionary. No, he wasn't. There was another Scot of the same name from Scotland who was a Christian missionary posted in Patna. But this Scot also happened to be John Spears was a Scot, but he became a Swami in a temple. So how Iqbalunnisa came in contact with him, I do not know. I think we need to explore further about it. The book by itself, it has a very strong message and a very strong voice, which somehow we have decided not to hear, not to pay attention to. The time in which this book was written, a remarkable period as far as women's interests in India are concerned. The issue of polygamy, the issue of divorce of annulment of marriage, the Tansikh-e-Nikah, was the most important issues in India's debates. And some of you might be remembering that the first Marriage Act was passed in 1939, and that dealt with the annulment because of you said that she would become a Christian. Muslim men were very scared of the fact because they didn't want to divorce, and for women the only way to get rid of violent husbands was to give up their religion, become a Christian. So automatically the marriage bond, they will be free of the marriage bond. And I think that's one of the reasons why Iqbalunnisa Hussain has included chapters on polygamy, on violent marriages, and had so strongly spoken about equality of men and women. Because that was the issue that was highly debated, and it has become a dichotomic issue in that period. Also, at that time, there were several voices, several women who were writing about women's status in Islam, but they were writing in Urdu. And those voices became very popular. Nazar Sajjad Hazar, for instance, there were women's magazines who really published. And remember, that was the time when Khalda Adib Khanum also visited India. So we had a great contact with Turkey. The movement that caused Ataturk to come into power was much welcomed, and there was sensations in the Muslim world in India. Of course, the Khilafat agitation came later on. So it's very remarkable. It's very important to find out the links that Mrs. Iqbalunnisa Hussain was able to establish with Turkey, and her presence at the suffrage conference in Istanbul. I think it's a remarkable period. There were other Muslim women also. I'm not saying that they were not, like Begum Sharif was there. there were two other women. The name is just slipping. I have in my notes, but I don't want to read out from that. So there was a sort of a resurgence. There was a reawakening amongst Muslim women. But what is remarkable about this woman we are talking about is that she tried to balance between her responsibility as a mother, as a wife, as a researcher, as an activist, and I would say her activism was not limited to her life only. The two examples sitting over here they illustrate very well the sort of activism that she created, because her daughter is still carrying that. So, in fact, women are supposed to create that sort of an activism. And when she talks about motherhood, and that's the topic that she chose to speak about on the conference, which was very unique. All women present, they were talking about suffrage. They were talking about women's rights. They were talking about women's fundamental rights. But Mrs. Hussain decided to talk about motherhood. It's very important. It's a very relevant topic. It's not that we are women who are educated, who are activists, who are in the public space also are going to deny or reject their biological function. Denial of the biological function of womanhood is not going to create equality. That is not equality. We are fighting for equity. We are fighting for equal opportunities and not for rejecting the role that we are supposed to play. And I think she did very well. We should pay tribute to that.
Can I?
Have I answered that?
No, that's great. I mean, you've given a very wide-ranging response. That's excellent. What I want to do in the 90 or so seconds, maybe 2 minutes at most that we've got left, is just to give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask a question of either panelists or to make a very short comment. So over to you. If anybody does have any questions or comments, questions for the panelists, this is your moment. Yes, there's a lady over here. Just wait for the microphone to come to you. We do have a microphone. We are recording this, videoing it, so we want to capture the microphone as well. So just a lady on the far end over here. If you want to stand up, madam.
Please put your hand up. So
Yeah, just over here. Yeah. Thank you so much. Please, if you can give your name and then your question, please.
How do you do? My name is Sumaira Kamal, and I wanted to ask something of Mrs. Salima. How did you feel when your mother was abroad? How old were you, and how did you feel as children? Were you affected by the fact that she had left you and gone to study?
Did you get the question?
When she left, it was very tragic for us. We cried for days because she was a good mother and we loved her very much. We missed her. But my father tried his best to keep us very busy. There was nothing that we were not taught. We were taught, besides the school, we were taught music, we were taught dancing, we were taught to play hockey and all sorts of sports. So we were very tired by the evening came and we just dropped into sleep.
So a very active home life was part of the solution there. Maybe just one more question, if anybody's got one more, we've got time for one more question before I'll just make a closing statement, no more than a minute with the closing statement. Please, your name and then the question.
And I want to ask, madam.
Into the microphone, just, yeah. Thank you.
I just have one question in my mind throughout years.
Can't hear.
That in those days, when your mother was there and she was working so much, there were few ladies and there was so much awakening. Nowadays we have so many women talking about liberty, fundamental rights, human rights. Why don't we have that type of awakening? Where is the gap between the two centuries? At that time few ladies were writing, like your mother, or now you are writing. But the gap is that nowadays we don't have that awakening among them.
We have a lot of ladies writing. There's a lot of awakening. There's a world of difference from that time to this time. World of difference. They've come up so much, the Muslim ladies.
Okay. Very good if we feel that way, yes.
I think there's more to be done, and I think this festival is part of the demonstration of the fact that there are more writers coming through. I just want to say we're almost at time, but before we do close, I just want to share a brief anecdote with you. 72 hours ago, I was with the first woman that Pakistan is sending to the UN as permanent representative, Dr. Malay Lodi. And when I was with her in Islamabad, and she's actually provided one of the 3 testimonials on the back. We have 2 academics and Dr. Malay Lodi, who herself has been an academic at some point. And I just want to read what she said in her testimony, not the whole bit, but part of it. And she begins by saying, 1940, the year of the Pakistan Resolution. Also the year Iqbalunnisa Hussein's part autobiographical book was published with a powerful title, Changing India, Muslim Women Speaks. The excavation and republication of this work with a new introduction and material will enrich our knowledge of important issues. Her writings on women in Islam and in India, female education, unemployment, poverty, East-West relations in Europe during her time there in the 1930s hold important messages today too. It deserves to be read by a wider audience, including young researchers. As her prescient commentary, as we've heard, I mean this is what's come out of the last half an hour, as her prescient commentary on a range of issues remain relevant today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. Dr. Salima, Ahmed, Professor Tahera, Aftab, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salima, Ahmed, Dr. Tahera, Aftab, and Arif Zaman. Wonderful session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
आपका
And
सवाल
thank
तो
you,
कर
audience. हमारा next program जो है वो उर्दू अफसाने का इंतखाब.
Books are outside.